All right. So good morning, everyone. This training is for ADA coordinators in the executive branch. The topic is service animals and emotional support animals in the workplace. I'm Julia O'Leary. I'm the general counsel and ADA coordinator here at Massachusetts Office on Disability. And I've got with me today Camille Karabaich, who is one of our information specialists, and she is also available to answer questions. So hopefully this will be an interesting training. I think there's a lot of misunderstanding around service animals and emotional support animals in the workplace. So looking forward to clarifying some of the issues, and hopefully this will be helpful. All right, so let's start by defining what a service and emotional support animal is. A service animal is a dog who is trained to perform a task for a person with a disability that is related to the person's disability. So the focus here is really on that disability-related task. An emotional support animal, by contrast, is an animal that provides companionship, relieves loneliness, or helps with depression, anxiety, phobia, sort of by virtue of its presence. So it doesn't have special training to perform a task, but the presence of the animal alone relieves certain disability-related limitations like depression, anxiety, phobia. The animal might be part of a medical treatment plan for a person with a disability if it's an emotional support animal, but it doesn't have that task that a service animal is trained to perform. So what are some examples of this? A service animal, it's gonna have a task. So that task might be providing directional assistance for someone who's blind. It might be alerting someone who has seizure disorder to that the person is about to have a seizure. There are dogs that are trained to alert their handlers when their blood sugar is low if they have diabetes. So the sort of the defining characteristic there is that task, that alerting the person, that providing guidance. Maybe they open doors or turn on lights or retrieve items for the person with a disability. An emotional support animal, by contrast, can be any kind of animal, and again, it's just the presence of the animal that's providing comfort and emotional support to the person with the disability, but not actually performing any tasks. So how does the ADA apply here? It's really an odd gray zone. In the employment context, the ADA is mysteriously silent on the subject of animals. Titles 2 and 3 of the ADA, so those are the titles that cover public entities and public accommodations, are really clear about expectations around service animals. They do not require covered entities to allow emotional support animals, only service animals. But the Title 1 is sort of ghostly silent on this. And so what we are told by the EEOC is that when we're looking at the employment context, a request to bring a service animal or an emotional support animal is going to be treated like any other reasonable accommodation request. So you're going to engage in that same interactive process that you would with any other RA request for a service animal. And that's different from the other titles of the ADA, and it can be confusing, and I think it leads to a lot of false assumptions around what's allowed and what's not allowed. So I think a lot of people think that, bringing a service animal into the office is sort of allowed by right, because of what we know about Title II and Title III. That's not the case. You're still going to go through that interactive process. And a lot of people think that emotional support animals are just sort of not allowed. There's a blanket prohibition. And that's not the case either. An emotional support animal might be appropriate in certain situations. I think those are probably going to be really rare situations. But if someone has a disability related need for that service animal, or for that emotional support animal in the workplace, and it would allow them to perform the essential functions of the job, then it is on the table as a potential reasonable accommodation. You would go through that interactive process. We're going to talk about how to do that. But what's really important here is that every one of these requests is going to be handled on a case-by-case basis. So there isn't sort of a bucket of what you have to allow as an employer and a bucket of what you don't have to allow as an employer. This whole world is in grayscale, and you're going to have to, do that same case-by-case analysis that you do with all reasonable accommodation requests when we're talking about animals in the workplace. So that's kind of jarring, I think, for folks to learn sometimes if they're not familiar with it. So one of the big concerns around animals, both service and emotional support animals, is what kind of documentation can the employer require about this animal? Because, there's a lot of potential risks associated with bringing an animal into the workplace, right? If the need for the service animal or emotional support animal is not obvious, you may ask for medical documentation the same way that you would with any other reasonable accommodation request. Now, I think that you're going to have many more instances where the need for an emotional support animal isn't obvious and you're going to need that medical documentation, because I think that's, those are for your invisible disabilities. And so the reason and the link is going to be less tangible for emotional support animals. For service animals, when we're talking about an animal that is a guide dog, you probably are not going to request medical documentation saying why the person needs that guide dog, and that's probably not going to be appropriate. But if the need isn't obvious, you can always ask for medical documentation. And as always, and most of you have heard me say this 1,000 times by now, the purpose of that medical documentation is to confirm the existence of the disability-based limitation and explain how the animal is going to support those limitations or needs. So, what is the limitation? Not what is the diagnosis, what is the limitation, and how does the animal support that limitation so that the person can perform the essential functions of their job in the workplace. You cannot require certification or registration of the service animal. There are a lot of vendors that provide certification and registration, but they're not sort of official. A person with a disability is allowed to train their own service animal, so long as the animal is trained to assign a task that assists them with that disability. So you can't require certification or registration of the animal. You can't require a training certification, but if the employee provides one, that is information that you could use to gauge the appropriateness of bringing the animal into the office. So if the person, voluntarily provides a training certification, that might show you that the animal is, house trained, is, under control, is well behaved, and that might help you better assess whether it's going to be a good fit for your particular office environment. You can ask the person with a disability what tasks the animal is trained to perform. And that will help you verify that it's a service animal and help you understand the disability related need to have the animal in the office or workplace. So if you're going to ask for medical information, what kind of medical documentation are you going to be asking for? It's always going to be from a continuing care provider. And as I said on the last slide, the purpose is to confirm the existence of the disability-based limitation and provide support for the specific accommodation requested. That's always the case, and that's why I say it over and over again, because I think sometimes people get confused about the purpose of medical documentation. That's why you're asking. If you have specific questions for the medical provider, you can either go through the employee, so ask the employee to have the medical provider address those questions, or you can ask for a release to talk to them directly. But as always, it's really important that you're not using medical documentation as a barrier to continuing the interactive process. So sometimes I see ADA coordinators say, well, I don't have your medical doc, so I can't look at this yet. And it's really important that that not be a barrier. You might not be able to close out the request without that confirmation from the medical provider if the disability related need isn't clear. But if they're able to show you the disability related need in another way, you need to be really careful about using that medical documentation as reason to not grant the accommodation request. So what are you going to talk about during the interactive process when you are dealing with a service animal or an emotional support animal? You're going to, as always, be talking to the employee about how that accommodation is going to meet the employee's needs and allow them to perform the essential functions of their job. The task that the service animal is trained to perform doesn't need to be tied to a specific essential function. So say the animal is a guide dog, and the person has a desk job, so the essential functions of their job don't involve sort of traversing, walking around, traversing the office, traversing the workplace. You still need to allow that guide dog into the office if it's necessary for the person to be able to access the workplace, right? And if it's appropriate in that work setting. So on the converse, the task would need to be performed at work or during work hours. So Camille, you have a couple of good examples of this. Do you want to share those?
Hi, sure. So one example of, a task that would make an animal a service animal, but that might not mean that that animal is required during work hours, would be if someone has the animal to wake them from night terrors that are caused by PTSD. If that's the only task that the animal is performing, then you're going to assume that your employee isn't sleeping at work. And so that's not a task that's going to be needed to be performed during the workday. That is kind of a specific example, and it's unlikely to come up. Often service animals are trained to perform more than one task, whether it's for just one disability or multiple disabilities. But that is something that you can consider. Is it something that needs to be done while you're physically in the workplace at that time?
Thank you, Camille. You're also going to look at whether there are other accommodations that would meet the employee's needs. So A service animal isn't necessarily an automatic yes, because, a workplace is a sensitive environment. There's a lot of different people with a lot of different needs in it. And sometimes it's not going to be the best fit. And so you can explore what other accommodations might meet the person's needs in the office. Maybe someone who uses a guide dog could get around within the office with a cane. Maybe someone who uses a dog to alert them to blood sugar changes could do more frequent insulin tests. So there doesn't necessarily have to, there isn't a mandate here, as I've been saying. It's a gray area, and you are allowed to explore other options. You're going to have to consider some practicalities, because this is a pretty big deal, right? Bringing an animal to workplace. So you're going to have to think about, where is the animal going to relieve itself? How many breaks is someone going to need to take the animal outside to relieve itself? How is that going to fit into the workday? Is the animal house trained is a really important thing to ask the employee. Will the animal be attended and accompany the employee for the entire workday, or will there be periods of time when the employee will not be with the animal and the animal will be left unattended? How will that be handled? Will they be crated? Is the animal going to require a crate or a wall hook for a leash? And a wall hook is sort of, what it sounds like, a hook on the wall that you can attach the leash to so that the animal stays put. Do they need a dog bed? Do you need extra space in the employee's office or cube to accommodate where the animal will sit? Will the animal be leashed or unleashed? What is the animal's behavior, and how does the employee manage the animal's behavior? Is the animal going to wander around the office approaching other employees, or is it a well-trained animal that will sit quietly next to its handler for the duration of the day? Does the animal bark? Does the animal jump up on people? Those are all things that you really need to ask the employee, so that you get an understanding of how this animal is going to fit in the workplace. And also, what techniques the employee is going to use in order to control the animal, because it is important that the animal be under control when it's in the workplace, for sort of the safety of all people in the workplace, and also just for the sort of in the spirit of it being a place of work and people needing to be able to focus. Will the animal distract the employee from performing essential job functions? Is the employee going to be so tied up caring for the animal, sort of managing the animal's behavior, that the employee won't have time to perform their essential job functions? You can also think about what impact it might have on other employees in terms of, is the animal well trained? Excuse me. Is the animal well trained and won't disrupt other employees? And then finally, and this is the one that I think causes employers the most consternation, is how do you handle other employees' needs? So maybe other employees in the office have allergies to dogs or have a fear of animals, and that's going to be coming into conflict with the needs of the employee who's asking for the animal to be in the office with them. So how are you going to do that? What you as the employer have the exciting responsibility to accommodate everyone. So you can't say no to a service animal request just because another employee has an allergy. You need to figure out a way to accommodate both employees. That might be that sometimes the employee can't bring their service animal in if there's another way to accommodate them. But you need to find a way to accommodate both employees' disabilities. And that means you get to be creative. So it might mean creating physical separation within the workplace. So maybe you give them sort of offices or cubicles in different sections of the office. Maybe you, let someone work from a different office location if that wouldn't sort of unduly burden them. You can come up with separate paths of travel so that they're not going to be passing each other in the hallway. Maybe someone wants an office with a door so that they can close the door, and that would reduce the amount of disruption by the animal. You can stagger work schedules or telecommute days so they're not sort of coming and going at the same time or not in the office at the same time. For allergies, air purifiers and additional cleaning are really good tools and not that expensive. If both employees are attending the same meeting, though, you're going to run into logistical problems, right? If they have to be in the same room. So one of the great benefits of our digital age and this sort of post-pandemic hybrid work that we're doing is people can attend meetings remotely. So consider whether the meeting should be a remote meeting or if one person can attend remotely. Ask if another accommodation would be sufficient for the employee with the service animal just for the duration of that meeting. So maybe they go to that meeting, they leave their dog in their office or their cubicle, and there's another accommodation that would suffice just for that, half hour, 2 hour long meeting. That can be an option too. If there's an allergy issue, you can ask the employee with an allergy if masking would help. These are just some ideas. It's not sort of an exhaustive list. Camille, did you have anything else you wanted to add about balancing competing accommodations?
I think there's a couple of things that I can add, sure. So one thing to think about when you're looking at all of like this whole process is that you can establish this as an accommodation for a trial basis, which can be really helpful in seeing how the animal actually behaves in the workplace, how the interactions with other employees are and things like that. So that can be a really helpful way to kind of test some of the discussions that you've been having with the employee about the practicalities. And another thing to point out that's kind of similar is that sometimes employees are requesting to have especially an emotional support animal on kind of a temporary basis. So for instance, a lot of workplaces are still hybrid at this time. And so there might be times when an employee is in the office totally by themselves, and that triggers some like higher instances of their anxiety symptoms or something like that. So it might be that they're just requesting to have their emotional support animal with them for like the temporary basis of while the workplace is hybrid or something like that. So I just wanted to add those as some kind of additional like temporary notices, I guess, about this process. And I did have one point about the accommodation discussion as well, if you want to go back to slides. Yeah, so this point about whether there are other accommodations that would meet the employee's needs. So the examples that Julia gave, those probably would come up in discussion. So again, like if an individual is blind and they use a service animal, it might come up in conversation that they can also use their cane. So perhaps it would be a situation where they use their service animal to get to work, but then the service animal is like attached to a wall hook or something like that. and they can use their cane to get around the office space itself. But I did just want to point out that when you're asking about what other accommodations might be beneficial for the employee, you should remember that using a service animal or an emotional support animal is a medical-based decision. And so you want to be asking people questions that are about accommodations that you can provide. So while like you will probably have discussions about, if they use other methods as well, you can't, suggest, that someone would like go on medication instead of using their service animal, because that's not something that you as an employer can provide. So I just wanted to provide that clarification on that accommodation point as well.
Thank you, Camille. That's a really good point. That is our presentation. If stop the sharing. I wanted to have plenty of time for folks to ask questions because I assume that we're going to have a lot of questions about this topic. If you have questions, feel free to write them in the chat or to raise your hand and I will call on you. But what is the status of mini horses, and are we seeing any other animals in state government currently? Very good question, Alan. Thank you. So under the definition of service animal in the other parts of the ADA, so that's Title II and Title III, a service animal is defined as either a dog or in some circumstances, a miniature horse that is trained to perform a specific task relating to the person's disability. So sometimes miniature horses can be service animals. So the status, I guess, under the rest of the ADA is yes, miniature horses can be service animals. The reason that people like miniature horses, I mean, there's lots of reasons. They live longer than dogs typically, so you can use the same animal for a longer period of time. They can be stronger. They can sometimes, if people are allergic to dogs, they're not allergic to horses. So there's a couple, there's different reasons someone might choose to have a miniature horse instead of a dog, particular reason. In the context of the workplace, because that definition of service animal isn't really operative because you're treating this the same way that you would any other reasonable accommodation request, it doesn't really matter if it's a service animal or not. So you could, someone who used a miniature horse could bring that miniature horse into the workplace. You would want to make sure that there was a plan for the miniature horse relieving itself the same way that you would for a dog, and make sure that there's appropriate provisions for how that horse is going to spend time in your office environment. Are we seeing any other animals in state government currently? I'm not aware of any animals other than dogs that have been approved as reasonable accommodations. That doesn't mean it doesn't exist. I'd be curious if any of you are aware of a dog, of an animal other than a dog that's currently in a state office. I'm not aware. All right, next question is from Emily. Are there limitations on emotional support animals? Like, could a snake be considered an emotional support animal for anxiety? Yes, there are not limitations. Emotional support animals aren't even defined by the Americans with Disabilities Act. They're in the more like the fair housing arena. So no, there's not a limit on what the animal can be. It can be any kind of animal that provides emotional support for the person with a disability. that doesn't mean that it's going to be appropriate for the workplace, right? The ESA of some brings distinct. Yeah, so I think with certain animals, they're going to be less suited to the workplace because they might cause disruption for other staff. And so you would need to consider that when you're considering the appropriateness of the accommodation request.
I can jump in on that question too. In the fair housing context, which is, a different context, obviously, than the workplace, there are a couple limitations that are outlined for emotional support animals. So there might be some argument that, that those would apply in the workplace as well. The big one that I can think of is animals that are like farm animals have to be housed outdoors. So, I think that adds to your consideration as well. Like it's much less likely that you would be able to approve an animal like a goat, because to my understanding, it would be very difficult to house train a goat. They, eat a lot of things that you would have in a lot of, workplaces like paper and fabrics and things like that. And so, it might be possible to train a goat. My parents actually have goats, and I think it would be a little difficult to train them. They are pretty strong-willed, but just that might be an additional consideration, is that if it is a more unique type of animal, then there's going to be, as Julia said, more considerations for how it's really going to fit into the office place.
Thank you, Camille. That's a really good point. All right, the next question is from Suzanne. Can you give examples of questions that would be appropriate to be following up with a medical provider about versus things that we shouldn't be asking? Yeah, so questions that you can ask the medical provider are going to be around the disability-based limitation. So what sort of functional limitation is the person with a disability experiencing as a result of their disability? And then how does the animal being with them at work help mitigate that limitation in the workplace? And why is that? Why is having either the service animal or the emotional support animal going to be an appropriate way to address that limitation in the workplace? So you can ask, how does the service animal help the person? What does the service animal do to the person, for the person? What other kinds of accommodations might work? And, kind of what is the relative efficacy of different types of accommodations that we could provide? So if we let them bring their service animal, what can we expect as a result? If we provide a different accommodation, how is that going to, what different result might we be able to expect? So you can kind of understand what your options are between different kinds of accommodations. You can ask the medical provider if they would recommend anything else as an alternative. Any other thoughts, Camille?
Yeah, I just wanted to add, I think that often employers really want to rely heavily on the medical provider and the information that they can provide. But I just want to remind you that, the employee is probably a really good place to get most of your information, because they're much more familiar with what the job entails, what the workplace is like. It's not, doctors are not experts in accommodations, they're experts in medicine. And so they may have suggestions of things that work for certain types of conditions. And it may be that they know that that patient has already tried those other things and those are not effective for them. But again, it is, the individuals within the individual's power to make their own medical decisions. And so they might choose a service animal over a medication or a different type of mobility device or something like that, for reasons that are, very personal to them, or that do have to deal with like the practicalities of the way that they live their life. And so the employee really can often give you better information about the accommodations that would or wouldn't work for them than the medical provider can. And I think you might find this in other contexts too, like if an individual needs to get a chair due to like a back condition, the doctor might be able to say, they could probably use more support in this region or something like that. But the doctor probably doesn't know, and it doesn't have an extensive knowledge of which brands of chairs exist, what specific type of chair they should get or something like that. So you can kind of think of it in the same way, that they can provide these kind of general points that, that the animal supports them in this way. Animals can support these types of conditions, but they may not have deep familiarity with what other types of accommodations would work in your workplace.
No, that's great. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Camille. And if folks need to leave early, that's absolutely fine. This is being recorded and we will be putting it on the website if you want to catch anything that you missed. So Nancy has a question about an employee who's on a waiting list for the training of a service dog. Once the time comes, are you saying I handle like any other accommodation, but because her condition is obvious, do not request medical documentation, but she still needs an approved accommodation on file, and she will be attending the training with the dog. Nancy, is this for her own disability though? And it's not that she's going and sort of has a service dog in training through one of the training companies?
Correct.
Okay.
She's legally blind and she's on a waiting list. And she actually reached out because the wait is quite long, but if last minute cancellation comes up, she wanted to make sure it would be okay if she takes a week or two off kind of last minute to attend the training, and I didn't go through any formal accommodation with that. We talked with her manager was completely fine with it. We all talked about it and it's yep, the time comes, let us know and go for it. And we left it at that. But so when she does have the dog, I have to have an accommodation on file.
You should have her request an accommodation, go through the interactive process, just the same way that you would for any other accommodation. And you can do that for the training too, just to make it really clear that you can grant leave for service animal training as part of the reasonable accommodation. Leave can be a reasonable accommodation if it's necessary for the person's disability. So you could do both as a reasonable accommodation, and you should definitely do the bringing the animal into the office as a reasonable accommodation, so that you have it documented in case there's any questions or in case there's any issues with other employees or down the line with the woman bringing her animal into the office.
Right. Okay. And also when she does take that time, is it just regular? How do you charge that time?
I would charge it as regular sick. If she wanted to use vacation instead, she could use vacation, but I think you could use it as sick because it is related to a medical need.
Okay. And I do not need documentation though.
No. Not if it's obvious. No.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Thank you.
Yeah. No worries. Any other questions from folks? Oh, here's one. Long one. All right. To what extent can an employer insist on practical restrictions such as animal must always be on a leash, cannot be left unattended, can only take it out for toileting at lunch break? That's a good question. So how much control can the employer exert over the animal? Camille, do you want to take this one?
Sure. I think that there are, some things that are going to be, more reasonable requests than others. Certainly, in general, service animals are expected to be leashed unless the specific task that they perform requires them to be off a leash. And if that is the case, then you could ask about how the animal is otherwise under control. So are they under voice commands, or are there like hand controls that they're responding to? You can certainly, talk a little bit more about behavior in those instances because you would want to ensure that the dog is always going to be, right directly with them if it's not going to be leashed. As far as, can only taking them out over lunch break, there are certainly other types of accommodations that people get to have more frequent breaks or to change like the timing of their schedule. That's probably something you would want to consider. It probably would benefit you to consider that as well, because you don't want to be putting the employee in a situation where the dog is more likely to like have an accident in the building. And certainly animals are still animals, so there are going to be times, if the animal gets sick or something like that, like you want the employee to have the ability to take that animal outside to relieve itself. So I think that would be my 2 cents on that. Was there an additional part of the question that I missed, another consideration?
Cannot be left unattended. No, I think you kind of got it. I think you covered it, Camille. Sort of, this is like a reasonableness analysis, right? So, you can't put so many restrictions on the animal in the workplace that the employee's use of the animal is sort of going to be obviated, right? Like the person needs to be able to get the use that they need out of the service animal. So you can make reasonable requests about, how the animal behaves, how the employee handles the animal, but you don't want to be so restrictive that you're going to have the animal have accidents, or it sort of restrict the usefulness of the animal in the workplace. We have another question. What if the employer thinks an alternative accommodation will be effective, but the employee prefers to use a service animal? This is like the age-old question of whose opinion matters most in reasonable accommodation requests. I mean, this can be said for a lot of different kinds of requests, right? It's going to come down to that interactive process and to sort of finding together with the employee the best solution. And sometimes you're going to be at an impasse. If another accommodation will meet the employee's needs, and there's real reasons why the service animal wouldn't be appropriate in that specific workplace, then the employee doesn't get to sort of necessarily pick their favorite accommodation or way of being accommodated. But it has to be reasonable, and you should be grounding it in fact and in sort of realistic, real world considerations. So if you just don't want the dog in the workplace and you don't have real documented reasons for it, I would caution you that you're getting into riskier territory. But in every situation, it's that open dialogue between the employee and the employer. You're trying to come to a solution together and kind of meet in the middle. So it's a kind of fuzzy answer. Camille, do you have any other nuggets you want to add to that?
Sure. So I guess one thing that's good to consider as the employer is that, what is the employee's ultimate recourse if they're denied this accommodation request? And that's going to be a disability discrimination complaint. And so that certainly, is a process that employers are trying to avoid. And, there are a set number of reasons that any reasonable accommodation request can rightfully be denied. So certainly the reasons that you're denying this request should not differ substantially from those reasons. So those are generally like that the reasonable accommodation would be a direct threat to the health or safety of others, that it's an undue financial or administrative burden, that it would cause a fundamental alteration to the business, that it's technically infeasible, although that's generally used as more of like an architectural access term. So like if someone needs an elevator and you can't put an elevator in the building, that would be technical infeasibility. Or if there's not enough information that is provided to show that there's a disability and a disability related need. But if that's the reason for denial, then the employee should be given more time to provide that information before they're denied for that reason. So sticking within those parameters can assist you in, essentially what you're doing is laying out an argument for if this individual thinks that your reasons for denial are unreasonable and they, bring a complaint against you, then those are the types of reasons you would have to use to support your denial. So it is good to, think about, I guess, like the long-term context of what you're saying. And that really can help you with thinking about like the difference between, it might be a little bit different or a little bit difficult to have an animal in the workplace versus it's really physically not possible in this type of environment. I think another thing to consider is looking at like the public accommodation space. Service animals are allowed, in restaurants. They're allowed to walk through salad bars. They're not allowed in pools, based on health codes, but there's a lot of places that animals are allowed that we would generally not consider animals to be allowed. So, if you have like health and sanitation type concerns, that's something you can definitely look into, like where animals generally allowed. Is that the type of health and sanitation concern that could really play into like technical infeasibility or direct threat to the health or safety of others, or is it not that type of situation? So I hope that those also help provide some context for your decision.
That was really helpful. Thank you, Camille. Another question. The Massachusetts Service Animal and Training Law. So this question is about how the Massachusetts Service Animal and Training Law sort of applies here. The Massachusetts Service Animal and Training Law says that service animals in training can go wherever service animals can go, basically. It is going to be, to be totally honest, there is not a lot of law on this in the employment context. And so I think this is kind of a novel issue and we haven't really seen it a lot because Title I is silent on service animals. I think you could go two ways. You could say that, we are public employers, and so both Title II and Title I apply. And Title II applies, so the office should be open to service animals because service animals in training are supposed to be able to go anywhere the service animals are able to go. And if offices are open to the public, then a service animal in training should be allowed there. That's like an argument that someone could make. On the other hand, because the ADA is silent on service animals and emotional support animals in Title I, you could also say that if someone is bringing in a service animal that is not for themselves, so isn't for their own disability, they're training a service animal maybe for a company, that request isn't related to their disability, and therefore you might not have to approve it under Title I. So I can't give you a yes or no answer to this one. I think it's a really interesting issue, and I would love to see, more regulation on it, or more, case law on it. But there really isn't a lot of information about how the courts would interpret that. Anything you want to add, Camille?
Yeah, I just wanted to add that the law, I mean, it's very short, but it does say that they have the same rights and obligations as service animals. So I think that that's something that you can rely on, that if it is a service animal in training, thinking about like the underlying purpose of this law, we assume to be that, you know, service animals need to get used to being in the environments that their handler is going to be in, and, you know, being around people performing their tasks with distractions and things like that. And so I think that, you know, because they're also under the same obligations, that you would probably be considering this later in the training process once they've met basic, you know, house training, behavioral standards, and they're really up to, they've already had their, you know, they probably are already, you know, pretty well into learning their tasks. So that way, you know, they still are going to be able to behave in the workplace and those sorts of things. They might have slightly more leeway because they're still learning, but, you know, you probably would not be able to, you know, get a brand new puppy and just bring that into the office as a service animal in training. I feel like there was another point on that that I wanted to make, but I have forgotten. So I will let you know if I think of what the other point about service animals in training was.
Thanks, Camille.
Yeah, I'll come back to that.
And if it comes up for someone, you know, please reach out and we can kind of work through it together with your agency counsel, because I think this is really a gray area in the employment context. And so you're not alone in figuring it out, but I also don't have like a super firm answer for you, unfortunately, at this point. Are there any other questions that folks have? There's no more questions in the chat. And if there aren't any more questions, I can let you go early. I know I said I was going to take longer because I'm usually longer winded, but all right. Well, seeing no more questions and no raised hands, I will give you half an hour of your day back. Thank you so much for coming to our training. And if you have, you know, kind of one-on-one type questions that you want to ask, always feel free to reach out to me about service animals or any other ADA related issue. So we're going to try to do more of these trainings, and we're going to try to always post the videos online afterwards. So please stay tuned for what's coming next, probably in about 2 months, so April. All right, thanks everyone, and have a great afternoon. You want to turn the recording off? No, that would be great.